I was tired. I wasn't getting enough sleep. I wasn't getting regular meals. I was being verbally abused on occasion by her dad, and it was a real stressful time. But I was focused in on my baby, and I was going to do it anyway. And that's how we got through it.
Balloons, bazookas, boobies, bosoms, boulders, cans, hooters, knockers, melons, honkers, jugs, rack, tatas, tits, torpedoes, guns, bust, doorknobs, coconuts, and our favorite one, the girls. Welcome to the All About Breastfeeding show, where your host, Lori, highlights mothers just like yourself and goes beyond the surface questions and digs deep so they share not only their joys and happiness in their daily breastfeeding life, but also their pain and struggles and how they worked through them.
Episode number 216. Welcome to All About Breastfeeding, the place where the girls hang out. I am your host, Lori Jill Eisenstadt, IBCLC, which stands for International Board Certified Lactation Consultant, and I spend my days helping moms with breastfeeding. I always love new beginnings. How about you? Giving birth is certainly a new beginning. Breastfeeding for the first time is another new beginning. I don't know about you, but breastfeeding to me the first time around, it was so foreign. It was weird. I talked about breastfeeding during my pregnancy. I read about it during my pregnancy. I took a class on breastfeeding. In hindsight, though, I'm not sure that any of this could have really prepared me for what was to come. Breastfeeding is a huge part of postpartum life, and I don't think I really knew that. It is what you spend a lot of time doing in your postpartum days. When you're not prepared for how to take care of yourself during your postpartum life, it generally means that you're not prepared to take on the work and the focus of breastfeeding. And I think this was definitely one of my problems. I had given no thought to taking care of myself during postpartum. It doesn't matter so much what you book learn about breastfeeding, the mechanics of it, how you build a supply, or even what it should feel like. Now, all these are very important things, and I incorporated all into my breastfeeding class. While this knowledge is crucial to early breastfeeding, new parents also need to take this information with them and combine it with some real-life practical knowledge about preparing for life postpartum. There is a huge gap between what society thinks we should know during our pregnancy, what we learn about birth and breastfeeding, and what actually happens in the short and long term during the postpartum period. It is not easy. It is tiring, exhausting, and overwhelming for many of us. If you've listened to enough of my shows, you've heard probably almost every mother say how unprepared she was for the postpartum period, and when asked if there's anything that she would change, she will frequently say, "I wish I knew what I needed to know to prepare to help myself during the postpartum period. I thought I was, just having a baby and going to be breastfeeding, and I knew I would be tired, but I didn't know how tired. I knew I would need help, but I thought my partner could do those things for me." And what they find out is that there's a lot more going on postpartum than they ever would have dreamed of. Going into the postpartum period unprepared, having a lack of knowledge of resources available to you, being strong and not utilizing the known resources, feeling like you should be doing it all yourself, or not having the resources and being left alone and isolated. All of these are common to many of us during our postpartum period. And how do I know this? I know it because I lived it. Most of my friends and colleagues have lived it. Our guest today is on a mission to share her knowledge so more soon-to-be parents are privy to what we already know, what we have lived and learned. It's not good enough to have a birth plan and just stop there. We need to have a postpartum plan to help us rest and recover from pregnancy and birth. to help us spend the time we need learning about our new baby, tuning into the world of breastfeeding, discovering ourselves in the role of motherhood. Call it what you will, your village, your tribe, whatever name you'd like to give it. We need this in our postpartum life to do more than just survive. My greatest wish for you is that you bring along a few good, trusted people along with you for the ride that know about the postpartum life so that you are not just in survival mode. These people know that as much as you would like to go back to your old life, that there is no going back. There is only going through and experiencing this new season of your life. In the words of today's guest, you need to be in the company of caring people who will keep you well-fed and well-watered. Welcome back to Season 6 of All About Breastfeeding, the place where the girls hang out. As you are enjoying today's show, think of other friends you know who could be enjoying this show and benefiting from all of the information you've been listening to. And remember, one of my mantras, don't let All About Breastfeeding be one of your best kept secrets. Before you move on to the next thing on your to-do list for the day, please, please, please do me a favor and take some action. Choose one person that you know who could benefit from all of this free information and send them the link to this show. And then please take 2 minutes to rate and review the show. I need you, my faithful listeners, because you are the ones who can help me spread to the rest of the world all about breastfeeding. And it's a show, it's a must for all believing who educating, advocating for parents and breastfeeding. I have a fabulous season with some really great, entertaining guests with interviews all lined up for you. You definitely want to subscribe to the show so it's automatically downloaded for you and you'll never miss a show. We will be chatting with authors about breastfeeding and professionals about tummy time, about community breastfeeding centers, about medications and mother's milk. We have some really great conversations with moms who have experienced their share of breastfeeding struggles, some heartbreaking stories of love and commitment. And this season, we have a frank discussion with a dad who just happens to be in the birthing field, who knows about all the benefits of breastfeeding, very well versed about it, and yet whose baby was not able to receive his mommy's milk. I really look forward to spending Season 7 together. Now let's come back full circle, take a deep breath in, and slowly let the air out. Relax and enjoy today's show. On today's show, I have one fabulous lady. She co-hosts a podcast, so she's a fellow podcaster, and her podcast is called the Fourth Trimester Podcast, which she hosts with Sarah Tribe. But today I have just Esther Gallagher with me today, and her podcast is one in which they talk to parents about how to get through the first few months following the birth of their baby. Their mission is to improve the fourth trimester for all parents. Esther is loving the podcast. She is finding this project to be a source of fulfillment on personal, social, and political levels. Her calling is to support new families during the transition to parenthood and participate in culture change through educating Americans about the lost legacy of new family support. Esther is the mother and mother-in-law of 3 grown-ups and grandmother of 1 wonderful kid. Esther has been a professional doula for 25 years in the San Francisco Bay Area in the United States and has been involved with birth and postpartum work since she was 18 years old. She studied midwifery, anthropology, and philosophy and has found them all to be pretty handy in life. She is a member of the San Francisco Doula Group and offers consultations in addition to doula services. I'm going to let you tell a little bit about yourself, Esther, but it's funny because you said that you've been involved in birth and postpartum work since she was 18 years old. And when I interview other midwives and doulas and childbirth educators, in addition to myself, I just have a funny little joke. I'm like, well, tell us one of the things that you wanted to be as a young adult, because surely you didn't grow up wanting to be a birth worker. And most of us say, oh no, whatever they were into was something far different. And then when they had their first baby, they kind of fell into this line of work. But you've been involved with both birth and postpartum work since you were 18. First, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, the family you grew up in, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about breastfeeding and then about your world.
I think I would say about me, the family I grew up in inspired my work from an early age. When I was probably in the sort of prepubescent stage, I asked my mom about how I was born and how I got fed. And, she told me in very positive terms about it, but she didn't edit out the parts that were difficult. Bless her heart. And she started her narrative answer to my question by saying, I always wanted to have you kids at home, but they just didn't do it that way back when you were born, which would have been, 8 years earlier. And not that they were doing it 8 years later or 58 years later, for that matter, in America. But in any case, she went about telling the story of my birth and my immediate postpartum. And I remember thinking I was quite bereft, learning that as soon as I was born, she was under the influence of, a gas that caused her to pass out. And so I didn't see her for 2 hours. That was so distressing to me as an 8-year-old hearing that story that I thought to myself, no one's going to do that to me and my baby. I was young. I was little. So that's how I got radicalized, actually, about this whole stuff. And then, when I was in high school, going to a little Catholic high school, kind of a progressive little Catholic high school in Northern California, one day the counselor asked me, so what are you thinking of doing in college? And I said, well, I don't know what I'm going to do in college at all, but what I want to do is work with moms and babies. Honestly, I don't know where that came from. It must have come from this earlier place, but I wasn't thinking in those terms at the time. It's just what I said in answer to the question. It almost just kind of came out of me without forethought. And she said, oh, well, then maybe you want to be an obstetrician. I said out loud, no way. That is not what I want to be doing. It was very clear. I was not interested in the medical model of care. So that was my answer. And that was as far as we got with it. So even though I was getting, honors level grades in high school, I kind of hit an odd social, emotional, and physical wall in my senior year of high school. I contracted mononucleosis. It was quite depressing. I was quite ill for the year, physiologically depressed. So when I met my daughter's father, I was in some ways quite vulnerable. It wasn't long before I got pregnant. Let's just put it that way. We'll cut that story to the quick. And rather than have an abortion, which was available to me, I just was sure that I wanted to have this baby. And in the course of that pregnancy, I found my way, oddly, just through circumstance, the circumstance mainly being that her dad wanted to be surfing. So I made my way to Santa Cruz, tagging along with this guy. That meant that I was geographically in the center of one of the hubs of home birth midwifery in America at the time. This is the end of 1977. So I was, in fact, able to have my baby at home.
You couldn't have done any better for yourself.
I know. And it all just happened. I didn't actually actively do much of anything. I honestly could not have done better for myself at that time and at that phase of life. So, I was 17 when I got pregnant. I graduated high school, moved to Santa Cruz, had my baby when I was 18. That's how that all started.
Now, where was your mom in relationship to where you moved in Santa Cruz? Was she involved in your pregnancy or newborn life?
Not much. My mom had a full-time job as a director of the Head Start program in the rural counties where I grew up. She was quite involved in that. She managed to take 3 days off to come stay with me starting the day my daughter was born. Thank goodness for it. But it was, just as my milk was coming in that she had to leave town, go back to work. So that was a really heavy, sad, difficult day for me, as you can imagine. And I'm sure for her as well. Although my mom has always very blithely felt as though I know everything and therefore, was never going to struggle. But, her belief in my capacity was always a boost, but I didn't always feel that way. And I certainly would have benefited from some ongoing daily support, which I did not have.
So you're the host of the Fourth Trimester podcast. Now that you have all these years afterwards, what are some of the things that you felt you would have liked to have seen differently after the birth of your first baby? So even though I can appreciate you being very sad, it was a big day when your mom had to leave you. Did you feel it at that moment just because you wanted your mom with you? Or did you feel it in the weeks afterwards because your mom not only wasn't with you, but you realized that you really needed her during your postpartum recovery period to help you with yourself, take care of you, help you with the baby, with the household?
Well, I would say yes, yes, and no. So yes to the first, yes to the second, and no to the second. So what I needed was not only my mother who adored me, and I think that's a real thing. I think the adoration that our parents have for us, if we're lucky enough to have that, is a real thing that when we're bringing our newborn in that we cherish, to feel that from our parents is wonderful. And it was wonderful to have my mom around for those couple of days and just feel her love. Of course, I know it's always there, but it's not the same as having it in your space a little bit. I could have benefited from a supportive partner who, if they were someone who could perhaps, and this is a strong word, but I'm going to use it, instruct my partner at the time, and I hesitate to call him that. He wasn't much of a partner, but could have let him know like what's appropriate and what's not. The first thing on my list being, don't come and go. This woman needs to sleep. She needs to sleep when the baby sleeps. So you're coming and going willy-nilly whenever it's convenient for you and with no sort of respect for this new parent's needs who's healing and recovering isn't beneficial to the family. That would have been nice, having an elder sort of there to protect the family unit as it's going through a phase of healing and recovering, right, and learning would have been helpful, I think. And inviting him into that, right? Like I invited him in well enough, I think, but to be encouraged in that might have been nice for him. And I don't think he had family that was doing that. They would have, but they didn't know to do that. So when I say no to it, what I'm saying no to is the fact I think very often our families have come from a non-tradition, right? They don't come from a village where everyone knows what you're supposed to do to support a brand new family. I could have benefited from meals, small meals around the clock. Nobody was making food for me, right? After my mom left, there was no food unless I prepared it for myself. And often the refrigerator was bare. So you get my drift, like just the basic human needs for anyone who's healing and recovering, let alone going through the physiology and the emotions and the spiritual changes of a new baby in the first 2 weeks. All of that was needed. None of that was seen to, except by my midwife who was making short periodic visits. I had no breastfeeding support. My mother could not have given me breastfeeding support. She had none and she didn't breastfeed. So I was on my own with the project of breastfeeding. And because of a conversation I'd had with my mother as a young girl, I decided that I was going to breastfeed come hell or high water. And I had hell and high water. It would have been nice to have a little bit of knowledgeable breastfeeding support if it existed at that time. I did not have that.
At the time, did you, because we have a lot of years to think about all this, at the time, did you recognize, did you know what it is that you were missing? Everything that you just listed is, of course, we know what new mothers need. Like after I had my first baby, there were a couple of things that I knew that I needed and could have benefited from. But there were other things that I just didn't realize that I even needed, that it would have made life a lot easier, and that this is what postpartum women just should get. I didn't, but I also didn't know what I was missing. Did you know what you were missing?
I think intermittently I did, but I think there was kind of an ethos that would jump in that I kind of adopted or inherited from my family, which, you know, who'd been children of the Depression. My father was raised by a single mother, you know, and it was sort of like, well, you just do it. You don't ask for help. And that's too bad. Like I've learned that there's a lot wrong about that. And I don't mean about the people. I just mean about that ethic. I knew I needed help and I didn't know how to ask.
Yes, I grew up with those same ethics, in that you just needed to do it yourself, and to ask for help was a sign that you were showing weakness, and it was not good to show that you were weak. So there's a lot of good reasons why I didn't even ask for help. But I think there was also partly the things I think that's what I talk to moms a lot about now, because I think we don't know what we don't know. And a lot of us don't know what kind of help we're going to need. We have this thing that it's all about the pregnancy, and then we're preparing for the birth. And I totally get that, because that's huge. But it's almost, that's where our line of thinking stops. We know we're going to get a baby out of it all, but we don't really think too much about that, other than, you know, mom's now like, I'm going to be on maternity leave for X amount of weeks and what I need to tell my employer, but not thinking a whole lot about all the little details that we need physically and emotionally for a healthy, smooth, and calm postpartum period. Like I didn't know what I didn't know.
I remember kind of hinting and asking and nudging a tiny bit my daughter's father, like, are you going to be able to kind of be helpful? And, you know, he kind of came from a place of bravado in all things, and sort of was just like, oh yeah, we got this covered. But there was no specifics to that. Like, I have no idea what it's going to be like for me on the other side of having gone through the process of birth. I'm not afraid of birth at all. I wasn't concerned for labor and birth. And lucky me, there was no reason to be, basically. You know, I was more like, what happens after that? I'm not worried about whether or not I will be motivated, compelled even to take care of a baby. But I plan to breastfeed. I don't know what that'll be like. I don't know what I'll need and all of that. So I knew just enough ahead of time, right? Because of my mother's story.
How many kids did your mother have?
She had 4 kids in 5 years. Pregnancy and birth were not big problems for my mother. In fact, she's always said she's felt better during her pregnancies than she ever felt any time in her life. Unfortunately, I don't think my mother understood that she was prone to postpartum depression, which I inherited. Then there's that. Now, my dad was, you know, great, and he always wanted to keep good food around, but he's not an easy personality. None of us are, you know. I'm sure there were things about this that were daunting to him, and when things are daunting, he gets a little fraught. I have a family history of depression, so things weren't always easy for my parents. And I was 15 months old when I got a brother.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. Having 4 kids in 5 years does not allow for the body physically or the mind emotionally and nutritionally for everything to recover. and be prepared for the next pregnancy and the next birth. So that alone is a risk factor for postpartum depression.
Yeah. I wasn't recovering as well physically and mentally as I might have had the circumstances been different.
Right. So, tell me a little bit about the postpartum that you went through as far as emotional level.
Well, I really only knew one other person in the new town that I had adopted, other than my midwife, who was there to kind of intermittently care for me. She lived right down the street, thank goodness, but she had her daughter 6 weeks after mine. So she was quite pregnant at the point where I gave birth, didn't have a tremendous amount of run out room to be sort of my caretaker in any way. And then she was newly postpartum. She had a whole extended network of midwifery friends. She was a student midwife, and her husband was off days at a time because he was a fireman. People were attempting to be supportive of her, not her family members. She had some community support. I didn't have that. So I was quite isolated with a new baby. Luckily, I lived near the beach because nature saved me. And my friend, Timmy Pereira, who was interviewed on my podcast. I mean, we kind of became each other's doulas in a way. We hung out with each other. We discussed this project of motherhood. We talked about what we were learning about breastfeeding. When we were both sort of able-bodied enough, we took each other grocery shopping and, got things together, watched each other's kids here and there for moments at a time, even breastfed each other's kids on occasion. So we were, thank goodness, that I had a friend.
My mother also had a friend. She had her kids in Brooklyn, and she wound up making, she had a really tough first kid, my mother, and she wound up making friends with another woman who lived in the same building who had a baby just a couple of months different than, I think that daughter was born a few months before my older brother was. Like you said, she saved you. That was your BFF at that time. And my mother, I don't think she realized it at the time, but she did connect with this other woman. Her name was Rita. They became such close friends for a good 4 to 5 years. And then actually her friend Rita moved out to Arizona. They maintained a friendship for over 50 years. And when it came time to retire, my parents always knew that they would retire in Phoenix because she always wanted to be back with her very first mother friend. And she did that. I hear what you're saying is that your midwife had a whole network of people that could help take care of her. And here you are, you're kind of on your own. And even if your midwife didn't have her own baby at the time, the reality is they may know what you need, but they usually still have a life of their own and they're midwifing and they lovingly go on to the next mom. So they can't take care of all of us, right?
Let's also not to put too fine a point on it. These women identified as midwives, not doulas. They knew of this thing out in the world called a doula, which was the name for postpartum care providers, right? It became the word that we use for birth doulas now, right? But originally at that time, the word doula really meant postpartum care provider. And there weren't any of them. There were very, very few of them. So this whole postpartum care thing has developed, I'd say, rather slowly over 50 years or more, probably more like 30. Didn't really exist in our mother's era. They only had friends if they were lucky enough to have friends. If they maybe lived in a city with an extended family, maybe their parents were situated to help them, but often not so much.
It was the generation before them and several generations before them that I don't think that necessarily a doula was specifically a doula to help the postpartum moms was needed, because at that time it truly was the village line of thinking, because they lived with their mother, sister, aunt, friend upstairs, downstairs, or right across the way, and they cooked for them and helped take care of them. And that was just something that the women did, the whole red tent. That's what they just did for each other. But then when birth moved, I feel, from the home to the hospital and families started to spread out a little bit more, that's when everything changed. That's when we lost a big part of the postpartum support. And then we went through a big phase there. And as you said, in the last 30 years, this notion of a postpartum doula has been growing. And I think in the last 5 years, I think it's been more of an explosion in that the women that I work with and meet, that while they may or may not hire a doula, they're more aware of a postpartum doula and what that person might do. And of course, you probably would tend to agree with me. I think that we have even more of a reason to need that because families are so spread apart. Mothers are going back to work so quickly. And a lot of moms have, I think, more birth trauma than they did when they were giving birth at home. So there's a lot going on that women really need a postpartum doula. People to take care of them. And some people do get it from the churches and the network that they have. And typically I find that it's meals, which helps hugely. It still doesn't cover all of the other parts that we need for a mom to have.
I wanted to sort of step in now. I don't know whether you've read her book or maybe even had a chance to interview her yet, but there's a wonderful investigative journalist woman who's written the book called The Big Letdown. And I recommend it to everyone, because it affects everyone. And it's the journalistic history and up-to-date information on how breastfeeding got to this state in America. But Kimberly Seals Allers, or Allers Seals, I'm sorry, I always confuse her hyphenated last name. She's now created this amazing project and it's community-based breastfeeding support. She's kind of launched this thing. I think she's in Philadelphia. And so I invite everyone to look her up and see what she's doing, because I think it's phenomenal. And I think we have to look to communities now because we continue to be a neo-local oriented culture. What that means is that when couples marry and begin their sojourn as a family, they typically move far away from their family members. I mean, let's face it, most people move away from their family just to go to college and then hook up with their mates and then start a family in someplace elsewhere. If we're going to continue to be that kind of a culture and we want breastfeeding as a value to thrive for just our health and safety and development as human beings, we're going to have to look to a community ethic around breastfeeding and develop support around that. So that's one thing I have to say about breastfeeding.
We're going to talk more, and I am going to put a link into the show notes with Kimberly, the author of The Big Letdown. And I do have a mail out to her, inviting her to be a guest on the show. So hopefully I'll get to do that too.
Brilliant. Yeah. We interviewed her on the Fourth Trimester podcast as well. So your listeners might want to listen to her. And it was mostly about the book. I hope you get her on, and I hope she can talk about her community development.
Yes, I'm very interested to hear more about it. So I will definitely jump on that one. You used a term, hell or high water, and I think maybe it's a generational thing because I'm from New York, but we're about the same age. I don't know, but I don't usually hear people use that term, and I love it when I hear something that is familiar to me. So you also use it in terms of breastfeeding, which, you know, we know is supposed to be this beautiful, lovely experience and joyful from the get-go. And some of us have struggles, and hopefully we get to that point. But we don't usually use it in terms of thinking of the beginning of breastfeeding. But you said, your words were, you know, you come hell or high water. So I really want to hear about your breastfeeding experience. And I get that, well, she wasn't with you, but she also wasn't able to help you. And we are still in this generation, my generation, the one before me, the two that came after me, that were not able to get help from our mothers with breastfeeding because many of them did not. And my hope is that this generation and the next generation with more women breastfeeding, that they will then be able to come back to that table and help their daughters. But for right now, you and me, we really didn't have much people helping us at all. So tell me how it went for you. Now you had your baby at home.
My midwife actually had young children at the time. My friend who was a student midwife was pregnant. She was actually at the birth of my daughter. I gave birth to my daughter. She was immediately skin to skin with me. And she didn't take long to latch on. She was just really great. Now, there's a photo of me with my head thrown back and my eyes almost rolling back in the back of my head with a big smile on my face. I was so excited to have her latch on. It was this dramatic sensation and it hurt. But it was also just like, oh my God, we're breastfeeding, the thing that I thought might not happen. But that was just the very happy beginning. Very quickly, I developed blisters, scabs, and extreme pain with latching. I went through a period of a couple weeks of very dramatic letdown sensation. The way I describe it is like somebody was sticking a hat pin through my scapula out my nipples. But, I do want to say, I was taking this all in stride. I was crying a lot, but there was hell and high water, and I was going to go through that. The high water was 3 days of extreme engorgement. I was going to do it, and flattened out nipples. And, I went into the project with somewhat flattened nipples. So my daughter had to pull my nipples out to be able to latch on them. And thank goodness for my daughter who was going to get breastfed come hell or high water, because if I'd had a baby who wasn't strong, who wasn't determined, and wasn't willing to kind of duke it out with me in the first week and a half, we may have given up. My midwife had said upon examining my breasts and nipples during the prenatal period, well, she told me what was up. And she said, it's going to be pretty tender. You can sunbathe, you can use a washcloth, to try to toughen them up. Frankly, that didn't help. And that was a bit about the advice I was given. Nobody was talking about tongue tie, which in retrospect is very likely to be the case with both my kids. In any case, we got through it. It was super challenging. And I was mildly anemic as a result of losing a bit more blood than I had a small hemorrhage. I was tired. I wasn't getting enough sleep. I wasn't getting regular meals. I was being verbally abused on occasion by her dad. And it was a real stressful time. But I was focused in on my baby and I was going to do it anyway. And that's how we got through it.
Did you cry a lot?
I cried a lot. During the engorgement phase, I couldn't get Susie latched on without the pain being so excruciating, that the tears would just run down my face and down my breast and down my belly and drip off my belly. I mean, I was crying a lot. It was really challenging. And, I know that part of the reason I was crying was that day 3, 4, and 5 of the postpartum period, even if you're not engorged, even if you don't have nipple pain, you are naturally on a hormonal roller coaster. And so tears of joy and sadness are going to hit you unbidden, and that's normal. And I was having a great deal of pain as well. Everything hurt day 3, 4, and 5. My every joint and muscle hurt from going through labor and giving birth as well. So it was a real train wreck.
My experience with my second and third baby was very different, but after my first baby and many, many hours of pushing and laboring in a way that was not best for me, I remember on day 3, I said to my husband, this is like the weirdest thing, but I felt better on day 1 and day 2, and day 3, I feel like I got run over by a truck. Like, what happened? That birth was 3 days ago. And so I had all those physical stuff going on, then all the emotional stuff going on. And you're right, day 3, 4, 5, even when things are going well with breastfeeding, we're still hormonal, emotional. We've probably been on this natural high after the birth, and now sleep deprivation is kind of kicking in, and there's a lot of stuff going on. Then if you add to that breastfeeding pain, not good partner support, all kinds of stuff, it's just that much worse. So yeah, I had many days of my baby would be crying to feed, and I would cry every time she needed to feed because feeding her made me cry. So it was, not the best of situation, but I came from a family, a long line of formula feeders, and my sister had 2 kids, and she formula fed hers that came just a couple of years before mine. So nobody knew what to do with me other than suggest you don't do that, because after all, I was fine. And that was the thing, though. I made that I must have just chewed their heads off, because that happened once or twice. And then while they didn't know what else to do for me, I did not have to sit through many, many times of people telling me, well, you should just give her formula because you were fine, and I'm sure your baby's fine. I wasn't told that. I'm sure they were saying it behind my back, but they weren't saying it in front of me after. And I can clearly remember a time where I just probably this animal came out of me, this voice that they probably never heard. And I pounced on them when they mentioned that, because that was not helpful to me. And I was pretty stubborn, and I was going to do this despite. And it's a kind of crazy thing now, because I sit here and I think, even though I know better, but I think if I would have to watch my daughter cry 7 or 8 or 9 times a day, clench her teeth, steel herself every time she had to feed, toes curling, and she's breastfeeding her baby. If I didn't know any better, I might be telling her the same thing. So I can appreciate that, because it's hard for a mother to watch her daughter cry and wince in pain. And so lovingly, they just want to fix it, and fixing it means to stop doing what's hurting you. So I can appreciate that. But of course, again, it wasn't helpful to me. The only book I had at that point was The Womanly Art of Breastfeeding, and it just didn't help me with all the pain that I was feeling. So did you have any book or references that you had at the time that you relied on for help, or was it just taking each day as it comes, and maybe the engorgement gradually got better, she was able to latch better, and things just started working out? Or did you have anybody specifically sitting helping you at any point, or books that you found were helpful?
Well, my midwife did basically just say, it's going to heal. Everything's going to heal. It is going to get better. And things like, I know your nipples look pretty raspy, meaning I'd gotten past the bloody spot part, She said they're healing from the inside out. So they're going to look worse than they actually are starting on day 4 or 5, right? They're going to get better from the inside out. Those scabs are going to come off, but underneath is going to be healthy tissue. There were little hints that things were going to change. And I think that really, just having those hints that it would get better just really helped me a lot. I don't remember reading any books. I think I probably had read Spiritual Midwifery, and there was probably some referencing around breastfeeding. Different people have found it to be very easy, and different people found it to be a little more of a struggle, but the community supported it. So and I knew that I was in a community that supported it, right? That everybody around me was going to be a breastfeeder, which was a shot in the arm, that before I knew it, I'd probably be amongst other mommies who, if we sat around and could chat together, we'd be doing it whilst breastfeeding. And so I had sort of a positive image of it all. I mean, my midwife had breastfed in front of me at prenatal visits. You know what I mean? Like, it was just sort of what you did. So all of that was very, very lucky and supportive. It didn't diminish the experience in the moment of just doing it. It's the kind of thing that now when I'm supporting new moms, I can say with a kind of confidence that we're going to get through this. I'm with you. We're going to be checking in on this every day. I'm not an IBCLC, so if we need somebody, I know who to call, who will come to your house and not expect you to leave your house to go get care at a time when you're healing and recovering. So you have options there. I luckily bring a set of resources that I didn't necessarily have myself when I was a new mom breastfeeding. You know, there's a way in which, oddly, yes, I was going to do it, come hell or high water, and I was experiencing hell and high water, and I was experiencing some sense of a lack of resource. But on the other hand, there was this whole resource that existed, which was that women breastfeed. Women I know breastfeed. Unlike you, surrounded by family members who did not, right? I was surrounded by my new little tribe, and they all did. And that was really great. I can really say, like, there's nothing like knowing that the community that you're gradually becoming part of, they just breastfeed. It's just what you do. That was really great.
Yes. And I know how that feels, because I had that with my second baby, because at that point I had joined a mother's group. I had joined a home birth group. Now I'm around midwives, but I didn't have any of that for my first. And I could hear what you're saying, in that you're going through it. It didn't necessarily diminish or take away your pain, but you could see the light at the end of the tunnel. And I had none of that. And I remember when my nipples cracked and bled, it would have been so helpful for someone to explain to me the way that your midwife explained the healing to you. And you may have felt this way also, but I remember being so freaked out. I mean, I was not used to touching and looking and spending so much time with my breasts and nipples as I had before. But anytime I looked at them and touched them, they were always looking nice and pretty, and they were intact. And now they were cracked and bleeding and somewhat unrecognizable to me and in pain. And I think just even knowing at a certain point, because you start to think, is it ever going to go back the way it was? Am I ever going to be quote unquote normal again? And I think just having a community of women telling me, we're going to be checking on you when your nipple does crack, it looks like that, but things will get better. And this is the healing process. So you have some hope to draw upon. Not all of us are so lucky. And interestingly enough, even, that was quite a few years ago. And you and I both know that there's a fair amount of women who unfortunately still don't have that support system, and nobody telling them that's okay. We're going to work together. It's going to get better. And so what do we have? We have a huge drop-off rate in breastfeeding, because a fair amount of women who start off breastfeeding don't really get the help and support that they need. So I'm thrilled that you were able to get that from the community in which you were living in, where mothers with babies and midwives, and they were breastfeeding. So it was part of the normal part of your everyday life. I hadn't even seen babies breastfeeding until my 8th month of pregnancy, when I attended the local Leche League meeting. Outside of looking at a picture in a book, that was my big experience, seeing other women breastfeed. And that was just once, about a month before I gave birth. Yeah. Everything changed afterwards, but I just did not have that at all. Taking a little break to talk to you a little about what you are going to be hearing more about Season 7 on the All About Breastfeeding show. My regular listeners know that I think we need to have a sense of humor about life and about breastfeeding and all things related to motherhood. This also extends to my work as a lactation consultant, business owner, and podcast host. You also know that I love quoting mantras, mine or other people's, and I love making up my own acronyms and borrowing them from other people and places that I hear them from. My newest one is Shameless, SHAMELESS, which stands for Spending Hours at Maximizing Exposure Leverages Endless Sales Success. Shameless. What shameless means to me in relationship to the All About Breastfeeding show, you ask? I must constantly work at this podcasting promotion thing, marketing and advertising. And let's face it, if I don't do shameless promotion, I will end up with nameless promotion. Nobody will know about the show and nobody will know who I am. What is my shameless promotion for today? Well, I always like to start at the beginning, which for me is my website, all shiny and new, courtesy of my husband Alan, who has designed this for me. Check out www.allaboutbreastfeeding.biz. There you will gain access to the library of podcasts I have in my catalog so far, plenty of free resources, blog posts, and of course, being that I'm a board-certified lactation consultant who spends her time away from the microphone helping moms who are having breastfeeding challenges, on www.allaboutbreastfeeding.biz, you will see links to several ways that you can contact me for breastfeeding help. I'm also going to mention another shameless promotion since we're talking about postpartum. When you go to that website, you will see where you can order my book called The New Mother's Guide, Practical Tips for the Fourth Trimester. Lots of checklists and ideas and ways to help you prepare for the postpartum period. Shameless Promotion Week 1 is ending now, and we will now get back to the show where Esther picks up the conversation telling us more about her postpartum recovery time. So how long would you say it took you until you felt like you were healed and it was becoming easier and you were just relaxing into the days and nights of breastfeeding and not having to be distracted with pain or concern or worries about breastfeeding?
I think I had a sense of, okay, we're definitely healing well. Everything's headed in the right direction by the end of the first week and a half, right? Heading towards the end of the second week. I definitely felt like, okay, yeah, my nipples are starting to look like breastfeeding nipples. They're not hamburger meat anymore. Every day was an adventure with a new little wrinkle. But by the end of the second week, while I was still experiencing quite dramatic letdown sensations, I'd gotten used to it. You know, it had normalized for me. My nipples didn't feel quite so raw. They were healed over. You know, I will say that I continued to have what I like to call exquisite sensation with breastfeeding pretty much from then on. I got used to it and I got to like it, actually. Do you know what I mean? It was no longer something that I related to as pain. I related to it as like the zingy sensation of breastfeeding. I might add, like, there's a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. I thought I had great kind of responsive nipples in sex play before I had a kid, but my nipples really got better. So I don't want people to think that the best thing to come out of breastfeeding is tough nipples, you know, that if you don't feel anything, that's the best thing. Because my experience was, I went through hell and high water and there was a payoff. I actually got to know my breasts and my nipples as my best friends in some ways, in a way that I wouldn't have ever recognized without having breastfed. I don't want to paint a picture that's so dire that people can't appreciate going through it. Much like getting through pregnancy and going through birth and healing from all of those things. I got to really gain so much in terms of my relationship to my body that I can't say enough about it, really. I don't get to say anything about it very often, but I'm going to say it now. You can edit it out if you need to.
Except when you come on shows like this and it's just what we really grew. Yes. We grew without talking about it. And I would agree also. I mean, before that, they were just a thing that I put into a bra. And like, that's really mostly what I thought about them. And then, of course, a lot changes. Yeah. We get to use them for breastfeeding and then for other things afterwards. And we I think, appreciate, well, I know I certainly appreciate the breast and nipples and those organs a lot more than I did when I was just, sticking them in a bra and going off for the day.
Yeah. Hoping they were attractive to somebody else. Right. And
exactly.
I mean, now they're attractive to me. And I love this saying that I actually bought a t-shirt that it says on it. It says, I make milk. What's your superpower?
I know. I love that so
Don't
much.
you love that? I stopped breastfeeding each of my kids when they reached 27 months. And I look back at it now and I say to myself, knowing what I know, like there were good reasons to wean and other reasons. If I had community support of a nature that really values breastfeeding, I would have been able and willing to allow my children access to the breast until they were ready to wean themselves, which might have been as long as 4 years, which is typical of primates. All the other primates, of which we are one subspecies, allow access to the breast for up to 5 years. In plenty of cultures, kids have access to the breast for at least 5 years, and then they don't want it anymore.
Right.
Right? Physiologically, they have no need for it anymore. But I was so dragged out.
I was going to ask you, what was the 27-month gig?
I weaned my son at 27 months because I felt it was only fair to his big sister. I'd only breastfed her for 27 months. And at 27 months, it was like a bedtime snack. It wasn't, we're breastfeeding 12 times a day, clearly, right? Like breastfeeding has a long trajectory that goes through many changes with our children as they grow and develop, right? I was just kind of at the end of my rope at 27 months. It was one of the things I had some agency over. So it was something I made a decision about. And, my children were weaned very gradually, right down to just once a day. And then there was one breastfeeding that we then took away. Like I say, I just don't know that I would do it that way if I had it to do over again.
Yeah. But what you're saying is that in hindsight, given what you know now and or the community that you lived in, if the community was different, or maybe you were just more, this is my word, you might use another word, but more confident in just doing your own thing. You may have just allowed your children to just, even that 1 or 2 feeds a day that I call it just a sip here or there in the morning and afternoon. That that could have gone on for another couple of years, just like that. And now in hindsight, you're like, well, that would have been fine.
Yeah. If when they were sick, I might have, they could have really benefited from the immunity benefits, right? The benefits of having a healthy gut, all of those things are things that I understand very deeply now. And there was almost no understanding of in my day. And, 30 years, 40 years ago, I think there are so many benefits to breastfeeding that we still don't. We understand very much more, but the culture does not support that. I think this is where, when I talk about culture change for future generations, I'd like to see us to really understand the benefits and values of prolonged breastfeeding.
Right. And it's not just nourishment for our babies, in that I know that I wanted to breastfeed because to me, it was just something that was, and I don't mean that it was a chore when I say this, but it was just part of what was supposed to happen. Like, I looked at it like I ate well. I took good care of myself during pregnancy. And so my baby was well fed and taken care of inside the belly, and that I would just continue that with the food that they were meant to have once they were outside the belly. And so to me, it just seemed like a natural evolution. And I know that it was healthy, but exactly delving into the specifics of it being healthy, not only for the baby, but also for me as a woman, for society, the environment. There's a whole host of reasons that both of us, like you said, we've learned. We weren't talking and hearing and reading about gut health years ago. We weren't hearing and reading about it was good for their facial and jaw muscles and just so much else of what we've learned.
Brain development.
Yeah. I had no information about IQ. It was just, to me, it was like a vaginal unmedicated home birth. That to me just seemed intuitively right, the way that it was supposed to happen. And it felt right. It felt comfortable for me. And that's what I wanted to do. And breastfeeding was just a natural evolution to the type of pregnancy and birth I wanted. And I mean, the research that we have now is amazing, and it's still ongoing. I mean, we've learned that our human milk has natural cancer killing cells. You know, we're going back heavily to donation, to milk banks, to milk sharing, to wet nursing. I mean, it's just, there's this whole evolution that's slowly going back to the way that I think that it should be and was many years ago. So I'm very happy to see that. I can appreciate what you're saying, though, that had you known then what you knew now, things might have been different. But we're still not killing ourselves or guilt over it, right? Because 27 years is still a lovely, wonderful amount of time to be breastfeeding.
Yeah. Not only that, there's so much that this is going to sound kind of funny or gratuitous, but there's so much that I feel I can pat myself in the back for that was part of culture change at that time. That's, moved things in the direction. My mom wasn't supported in breastfeeding. I breastfed. My daughter breastfed. That's a big shift within one generation, if only that. I definitely don't suffer from a great deal of guilt about it. I only think about the benefits to myself and my children in terms of, wouldn't that have been nice?
Because sometimes some feel that way. And even moms that I talk to, they're like, only 12 months. I'm like, 12 months? 12 months of breastfeeding. That's huge.
Way to go. Yeah.
Way to go. Whatever.
Yeah. Hey.
Great. But people we talk about this a lot also, expectations and goals. And if they don't meet certain things, then, women are really good at battering themselves. And yet when we sit and we take a look at all the things we do as a mother, we should be not battering ourselves, but giving ourselves, like you said, I don't think it sounds gratuitous at all. We should pat ourselves on the back, tell ourselves what a great job we've done. And mothering is really, we know it's like the hardest thing. What I really want you to talk about for a few minutes, as a doula in your work life, what are some, let's think about 3 things that you talk to moms about if you meet them before they give birth. What do you share with them about breastfeeding?
Well, I share with them that I'm going to be seeing them on a day-to-day basis so that we can troubleshoot immediately, right? So that if things crop up, we have a go-to plan right away so that things don't become so erosive that it's so challenging to get back on track that you might find yourself just kind of throwing in the towel. So that's a reassurance. Just in terms of working with a doula, that's a value potentially. That breastfeeding is usually somewhat challenging in small or even large ways in the first 2 to 6 weeks, but that meeting those challenges, we can get beyond them and get to potentially, very highly likely, get to a very satisfying breastfeeding relationship by the 6-week mark. And that it sometimes takes some moms a full 6 weeks to get to the place where they can look around and say, okay, we made it, right? So it gives them a broadened idea of what they might be looking at in terms of breastfeeding success, so that they're not thinking, oh, I've got to have this nailed down in 2 weeks or it won't be successful. Because many times I've worked with moms who've really had to kind of root out one issue after another, or one big recalcitrant issue, and it takes time. And that's about the time that I help them wrap their minds around the healing and recovery period from giving birth. There's a reason we call it the 4th trimester, and that's because a lot of different things are going on simultaneously and intermittently and one after another over the course of 3 months before we have a 3-month-old who's no longer a newborn, right? And so getting to that mark, there's a lot going on that probably requires a modicum of support and not just imagining that you're somehow going to get there magically and it'll be okay. Be well resourced. You're going to need to be well fed and watered in this project, and you're not going to be doing it for yourself. If you're relying on yourself or even your partner to keep you well enough fed and watered during the 24-hour cycling of breastfeeding, healing, and recovering, it's not going to be enough. It may be enough, but it may be just enough. Think in terms of, how do I be well nourished during the period of healing and recovering and sorting out breastfeeding while I'm nourishing my baby? So being nourished is a cornerstone of good breastfeeding. In terms of a positive experience, it doesn't mean that you won't be successful breastfeeding if you don't have these things. It just means that if you plan to have these things and you put into place ways to have these things, you're guaranteed to have a more positive experience. So those two things are the main thing. Know that there are women who are highly trained. They're called IBCLCs, lactation consultants are women who have studied all the possible foibles of breastfeeding. And if you're going to need one, it's worth the money. Don't spend an extra $1,000 on the best baby bed.
Yes, I see a lot of money, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars spent on a chair that you're going to be sitting breastfeeding your baby, when we can show you how to breastfeed your baby most anywhere. And you're right, put all your money into a huge chair. And if you're struggling with breastfeeding and you give up, you're not going to be sitting in that chair.
Isn't going to do you darn bit of good.
Exactly.
And then, of course, the fourth thing of that I tell them is, I work in the first 2 weeks. I'm not going to just show up when you think you need it. I'm going to be there in the first 2 weeks. And one of the first things I'm going to show you how to do is nurse well and successfully and in a relaxed manner in bed, so that you can heal and recover by way of resting, not being upright and sitting on a bottom that might have stitches in it, or having to get out of bed every single time you breastfeed when you have a C-section incision and might benefit from lying down for longer stretches. It's not to say you never get out of bed. It's just to say that you have the option of resting for some of those breastfeeds, 12 of which you're going to be doing every day. So those are the things I tell moms in advance.
Esther Gallagher, I love you for many different reasons, and I'm going to try and click off some of the things that you said that I just love you for. One of them is the anticipatory guidance that you give to moms before they've given birth, to let them know that with regards to breastfeeding, that it is likely not going to all go very easily and smoothly. There will likely be bumps along the road, and there might be big bumps. And I am here to help you through them. And if I don't know how to help you through them, if I get stuck, you're talking to them about IBCLCs who have studied this inside and out. You can make connections with them, ones who come to the home so they don't have to leave. So I just love that anticipatory guidance you give them with regards to breastfeeding. And I also really love, because I've done doula work too, and I love that you're also telling them about the resting and the recovery from the pregnancy and birth that also needs to happen. One of the most difficult things I think that we do with pregnant moms is just paint the picture of rainbows and birds singing and everything, just when you have this baby, everything's just going to be so beautiful, because we want everybody to feel good. That often does not happen. There's usually some bumps along the road, even when things are going pretty well. Like we said before, at the very least, you have physical recovery and emotional recovery that's going on. So to be able to prepare moms and their partners for more than likely some rough spots and to tell them to expect that. And also to be able to tell them, and these are my words, not yours, but hey, that's why you're hiring me, because I know all about this and I will be checking in on you and I know how to help you. And if I don't know how to help you, I have a network of people who can. And I just love that you're saying that to moms. And of course, it's always music to my ears when I hear doulas or physician or pediatrician tell moms, put some money aside, be able to hire postpartum help, whether it's doula, house cleaning, a lactation consultant. Don't put all your eggs in one basket and have all of this beautiful furniture and everything all set up, because if any part of that is hard, you've exhausted all your funds to get the help that you need postpartum. And the thing is, so many people are just not talking to moms about that. And that's why, Esther, I wanted to hear what it is that you say to moms. And I just love everything that you talk to them about. The one cute way you had of saying it was, I often talk to moms about staying well hydrated and well fed. And I might quote you wrong, but I think I heard you say well fed and watered. And I just love that.
Yeah. I grew up taking care of animals. We didn't live on a big farm, but we often kept some, an animal or two for eating. And so I was often the person in the family who was feeding and watering the animals. That's what you called it, right? Well, I just transferred that to my mom. I mean, like you need somebody to get this and put it in front of you because you've got your hands full. And when you don't, you've got to get up to go pee and brush your teeth. There's no reason why there can't be food and water in front of you every time you're breastfeeding.
That's perfect. Did you see it was either an article or one of those Facebook memes that showed a mom sitting in a chair breastfeeding her baby, and she had Camelback. This mom, her husband or partner or whatever, it was a joke, but they had set up this huge plastic basin filled with water. And he gave her that tube so that she didn't need to keep saying, honey, can you give me some more water? Or he didn't have to keep doing that. She just had, like 10 liters of water sitting there in this tub next to her that she could just drink when she wanted to. I thought that was funny.
Well, I just thought of a great invention, and I am going to patent this. Every single one of those front packs should have a receptacle with a straw stuck to it, like a flexible straw with a lid that you can just be carrying your baby around and sucking water out of the backpack or the front pack, right? Like, doesn't that just make such sense?
Well, yeah, that is one of those ideas that I'm already thinking now. Why didn't anybody else think of that? So let's see if you take the ball and run with that one. That will be interesting. Esther and her Camelback Ergo.
Yes, exactly right.
I want you to tell us a little bit about your podcast and how you connected with Sarah and why you both decided to do the Fourth Trimester podcast.
Well, it is a super fun story. Sarah called me up looking for a birth doula, and I came to their house and I interviewed with Sarah and her husband, Ben. And I said, you didn't ask about this, but I always make it a point at an interview to talk about postpartum care because I find that people actually don't have it on their radar. And so I talked to them about it, and Sarah's eyes got really big. And she's got these big, gorgeous eyes already, and they just open wider. And she goes, wow, we're going to be thinking about that. And of course, they then hired me to do postpartum care. Fast forward to day 4 postpartum. I'm coming in to give Sarah a little snack tray and fill up her fluid receptacle.
You're watering
while
her.
She's breastfeeding there. Yep, I'm watering her, and she's breastfeeding, and she's got her little earbuds in, and I sort of, said, what are you listening to? And she took her earbud out and she goes, I'm listening to a podcast. And I said, oh, I love podcasts. She said, you should do a podcast. And I looked at her and I said, I've always wanted to do a podcast, but I am just not in any way technically ready to do a podcast, she said, we're going to do a podcast. So during her fourth trimester, she spent a little bit of time online while breastfeeding because laptops, you can breastfeed and do your laptop if you want to. And she figured out how to get us started doing the podcast. And that's how the fourth trimester podcast was born. We had a couple of meetings about what we wanted to do. And she really let me lead by way of, determining sort of the direction of our podcast and what to call it. And she got busy figuring out the technicalities. And here we are. Now we have a wonderful podcast. I just am so proud of her. And I just feel so grateful to her that she was willing to be our producer. And I invite everyone to listen to it. And I want to add, Lori, that kind of circling back, I think, everybody owes it to themselves during their pregnancy to listen to our podcast to get up to speed in advance, right, of becoming a parent about what you're going to need and how you're going to need it. And then simultaneous to that, encourage anybody who said to them during their pregnancy, hey, just let me know what you need once the baby comes. I'd love to help. Well, those people often don't know what they need. And you don't know what you need. But Lori and I know what you need. Sarah and Laura and I know what you need. And our podcasts are a way to teach those people who want to know how to help, not only what to do, but what not to do. So I recommend our podcast to the listeners by way of teaching. That's how we create culture change. This is the way we do it now. We listen to podcasts and we learn important things. And I might add, postpartum care and lactation consulting make an extra special shower gift. New parents are going to get plenty of onesies and disposable diapers. They don't need more of that. They're going to need knowledgeable care. And that's what we provide.
Absolutely. And I don't really say this. This is also going to sound very self-centered in a way. However, we do this work because we love doing this work. We podcast because we love sharing this information. And you and I have pretty much the same spiel in that we're saying to moms and dads and partners, put aside some money. You can only use so many blankets, so many onesies, so many cute socks, so many cute dresses and toys and rattles and all that kind of fun stuff. But that really won't mean much in the first 3 months if you're having some of the common struggles, if you don't have the good enough support for your postpartum period, the good enough support for your early breastfeeding days. And I often tell parents that frequently it's so cute because sometimes couples think like, well, but he's going to be home for 2 weeks or 4 weeks or 6 weeks. And I often talk to them, and that's great. But if he is running around like a chicken without his head, taking care of the household and meals and the shopping and phone calls and doctor's appointments, all that, he is going to be so wiped out. He is not going to be able to enjoy you and or the baby just the way you're not able to enjoy it. Both of you, there are things that you can do to prepare ahead of time, but also afterwards, there's just things that people can do for both of you so you can enjoy that period. And plus, just like you have never been through this period before, don't know what to expect, neither does your partner for the, especially if it's the first go around. And it's the same thing with breastfeeding. So I tell people, if I can get my hands on them, I say that in a loving way, and they're even first trimester, I'm telling them, put aside $20 a paycheck. By the time you have your baby, you're going to have an old-fashioned envelope filled with some cash that you can use for services afterwards. And I always tell them, if you don't wind up using it, needing it, well, you will have some very nice dinners. You'll be able to get a nice massage. The money can just go back in your savings account, for goodness sake. It's not going to go to waste. But the hardest part is having it put aside ahead of time so you don't feel like it's a hardship during your maternity leave in getting money. And of course, I don't know what you do, but I often talk to parents about requesting it as gifts because, again, you only need so many onesies.
Yeah.
There's so much more that you could put to use for breastfeeding help and postpartum birth doula and postpartum doula work.
Well, and I'm going to add one more possibility, and that is this. If you're well-to-do and this is not a hardship for you, put aside that money and pay it forward to a mom who's living in poverty. Buy postpartum care for her. We have terrible maternal child survival rates in the African American women's community. Find someone in your community who's necessarily going to be struggling simply because of her ethnicity, her, the color of her skin, and make her life more resourced during a critical time in her and her child's life.
Yes, and that's wonderful sentiment, a wonderful request. It's a very beautiful thing to do, to be able to be in a position of pay it forward. Some people, they may not have that extra funds, but I actually just had a mom that I work with. We got into this subject, and when I came home today, she actually did what she said she was going to do. And this is a whole week ago. She said, you know what? I can now breastfeed my babies laying down. I don't necessarily need all this stuff that I have. And I came home to find a couple of pillows on the bench outside my house. She decided she didn't need them anymore. Someone else could benefit. So it's those little things that can mean a huge, huge, huge big deal for the next mom.
Yeah, I mean, this is part of the way that we get to feel connected to our community of mothers, even if we never meet them, right? There's an organization in San Francisco called Homeless Prenatal. My moms donate, they send me home with all their leftovers and stuff they're never going to use. And I bicycle it over to Homeless Prenatal. And there may be an organization like that in your community. Find out.
We definitely have. We have Mom's Place. We have quite a few places like that. Thanks for that reminder. I think that's a wonderful way, actually, to end our lovely talk. First of all, if you put another podcaster together, we could talk for hours. Then if you put another podcaster who's a birth, breastfeeding, postpartum junkie, well, then in a loving way, you might as well set aside a whole day for us because we could easily go on that without even taking a break, right? Tell us how they could get to your podcast and tell us how they could get an email to you if any of my listeners wanted to do so. Great. Okay.
We have a newsletter, I think, via our podcast. So it's the fourth trimester podcast.com or something like that online, but you can reach the podcast itself via iTunes and Google Play. That's how to find the podcast. And then there's email associated with that. And you can then sign up for our email newsletter, and we're on Facebook. So those are all ways to connect with the fourth trimester podcast. And then if you live in the Bay Area and you're looking for postpartum care or consultation ahead of time or during or after, I'm at the following email, placentaeg@gmail.com.
That's terrific. Thank you so much. The more I talk to you, I already knew when I started listening to your podcast, but the more we talk together, it's interesting. I have all these things going through my head. And I speak to a lot of people who are into the breastfeeding postpartum world. But the more I talk to you, the more I just think, before you said, Lori, Sarah, and Esther, I just think our shows and the work that we're doing, we just really complement each other nicely, don't you think?
I agree. I was thrilled to find out about your podcast. I was just like, oh, that's brilliant. Oh, one more little add-on, and that's that my sort of online brochure and with a very short media page that might interest your listeners is just esthergallagher.com. So they can track me down on the internet that way and look through my media page if they're interested. It doesn't have a lot to offer, but they might get interested.
Perfect. Well, I think that anybody that sat with us for this interview and listened to you, I can't imagine anybody not wanting to follow through and check out the Fourth Trimester podcast and not check out your doula services and your newsletter and want to get to know you a lot better through those mediums. And my regular listeners know that every time I put out a new podcast, I post it on the Facebook page and on my website, on the show notes, all the links that we just mentioned. Nobody has to remember it because all they need to do is go to the podcast page and they'll find that out. Esther Gallagher, I want to thank you so very much for spending time with me today and for providing just a wealth of information and knowledge and encouragement to my All About Breastfeeding community. Thank you for being with me today.
Oh, thanks, Lori, so much. It was a distinct pleasure. I'm so thrilled to have done so. And I hope your listeners find all the encouragement they need.
A very big virtual hug and thank you to Esther Gallagher of the Fourth Trimester podcast for her candor during our time together. You can only imagine how hard it is for some moms to be so vulnerable and share personal stories about their mothering life for the rest of the world to hear. I know Esther is highly motivated to do so because as a postpartum doula and co-host of the Fourth Trimester podcast, she knows just how important it is to talk about our experiences, to share it with other moms, and to educate our community on how important it is to put new moms and babies as a priority. My hope is that by you listening to today's show, you'll be motivated to prepare for your postpartum life by listening to the Fourth Trimester podcast. Esther and I talk proudly about how our shows really complement each other. How fortunate is the mother who has both our shows on her podcast playlist. One last note. In 4 more days, I debut our new Friday shows. It is called, well, you know what? I am just going to have you tune in on Friday to find that out. Until the next show, bye-bye.